Welcome back to another edition of the Soap Opera Diagnosis. This week I'm talking exclusively about Days of Our Lives because I just have so many problems with the current stories. They are almost all, so bad. There is honestly possibly 3 of the worst storylines in the history of this show happening right now at the same time. Definitely at least 2 of the worst ever. And what started this ball rolling with the quality of this show dropping to abysmal levels where it is a cartoon and a joke was the Possession 2.0 that they should have never started. It's like they got a couple months of publicity from that, and now they're going to be dealing with several months of fans complaining about the quality of the stupid storylines. But what I wanted to do today was I decided I need to go back and see where the Possession really falls with past bad Days of Our Lives storylines. I wanted to kind of rank what I think are the worst storylines in the history of Days of Our Lives. And there's honestly a lot. If you look into the history of Days, there is unfortunately a lot of bad storylines, especially over the past 20 years. Just a lot of bad decisions and a lot of ridiculous storylines. Some would probably say the last 30 years, but I enjoy a lot of the wackiness and absurdness in the 90s. Could be just nostalgia because I was a kid growing up in the 90s. But yeah, I want to see if the Possession really is the worst storyline in the history of this show. The Possession 2.0, that is. The Possession 1.0 did not make the worst of lists. Even though I'm not fond of that story either, I don't think it is the worst of ever. So I'm going to go in order here from 10th worst to what is the very worst storyline of all time. And at number 10, this is the only storyline that predates the 2000s in my list that makes the top 10 worst storylines in Days of Our Lives history. And that is back in the early 90s when they decided to pair Shane and Kayla. Because we had years of Shane and Kimberly being a super couple. And Kayla is Kim's sister. And Kayla recently loses Steve to his death, in quotation marks, because clearly, as you see today, Steve is still alive. This was bad because it did ruin some characters' reputations. And when a storyline ruins some characters, that's when you really know it's really bad. And I think it damaged Shane, but it extremely damaged Kayla because at the same period, they kind of turned her into a bit of an ass. So I feel like they really ruined the character of Kayla. And this was the character of Kayla's last storyline before she left the show and didn't return for 15 years. So, yeah, that is why this storyline makes the top 10, because it did really hurt the character of Kayla. Because, you know, she's really going against not only girl code, but family code. You're starting to date your sister's ex-husband, your ex-brother-in-law. Awful. Coming in at number 9, there's a lot of storylines from this period of Days that I don't like, but one of the worst for me was the EJ, Sammy, Rafe triangle, because I hated both couples. Now, I know there's plenty of EJammy fans out there. And, well, is there any Say fans out there? I don't seem to find any. But if there is Say fans out there, I don't know how you came to that conclusion, because what a boring-ass couple that was. But my main problem with this storyline was that they had to take Lucas out of the equation to even make this storyline possible in the first place, because there were plenty more Lumi fans than there ever were or ever will be Safe fans. So making this triangle, I think, made for some pretty boring television, because I didn't care, and I didn't like EJ and Sammy as a pair because of the way they started them as a pair. You know, EJ basically raping Sammy at gunpoint, So yeah, this triangle, E-Jammy versus Safe, bad times for this show for me. Around the same time period, we had other characters in triangles a lot. And coming in next on my list is, I'm going to call it ruining a legacy character of Stephanie Johnson, because they had Stephanie in two different triangles with Melanie Jonas, who is a life-sucking character of her own, only topped by her father. But Melanie Jonas was in triangles with, I can't even remember his name, I want to say Nathan and Stephanie. And then there was a triangle with Philip and Stephanie. And each of those triangles, Melanie was written on top of that triangle, and Stephanie was always written very pathetic constantly. And I hated that they turned Stephanie Johnson into this pathetic person who seemed to always be losing in love triangles. That was another bad time for the show in like the early 2010s, I believe. I don't know the exact years, but it sucked nonetheless. Now going back to the mid-2000s for my next storyline that I think is one of the worst in Days of Our Lives history comes Malice Swan, aka New Salem. We had the Marlena as a serial killer plot, which is another story I'm not that fond of, but I can't deny that the serial killer plot didn't make for gripping television at times, even if it eventually pissed me off too much. And on one hand, I'm glad that they didn't stick with the killing off all of these good characters, but at the same time, the way this all came about in the aftermath of killing off so many of the big characters was this New Salem, basically like on a Damira island, where all the supposed people that Marlena killed are there. Then when Marlena supposedly dies, she goes there. It was convoluted as all hell, and it dragged out immensely, and I was not quite fond of it. But that was topped by the aftermath of Malice Swan, which is my next story on this list. The Malice Swan aftermath, or Malice Swan, I don't even know how it's frickin' pronounced. The aftermath was even worse than the initial story, because then, while most people get off the island, Roman and Marlena and Lucas and Cassie don't get off the island. And they're like held at a castle by Tony for what seemed like years, even though it was probably only several months. I'm pretty sure it was most of a year, though. If I'm remembering incorrectly, I don't know, but it felt like forever, and I had already lost so much interest in Days by that point. Because what pissed me off even more is Jack and Cassie are there, too, and they're barely shown. And that part of the story was terrible, because James E. Riley hated Matthew Ashford, and they couldn't get the actress who played Cassie, I can't remember her name at this time, they couldn't get her back on contract, because, initially they didn't tell all these people that they fired and killed off that they were going to bring her back. So yeah, it was a plot to kind of make Roman and Marlena close again, but nobody wanted to see that. So this was just terrible, slow TV. The aftermath of New Salem was horrible. Next up on my worst days storylines list is a current story. No, not the possession, but Sarah thinking she is Renee Damira. This storyline is so stupid, and I will break it down when Days is probably last in my rankings again here in a week when I start doing rankings for March. But the fact that Sarah, who is younger than all these people she's in the storyline with, like Tony and Anna and everyone, she thinks she's Renee, but they all aged and she didn't. How does that make any kind of sense? And why doesn't someone just show her a picture? But what I think is even worse with the stupidity of the storyline is like, it's not even amnesia. It's not like she has a chip in her head like the Princess Gina storyline or John Black. No, she was just reading a diary and this is who she thinks she is, even though it makes no logical sense. This storyline is dumb at its core. It has a weak starting point, and anytime a story has a weak starting point, it's already bad. But then you just add on all the other stupidity on top of it, and it's just atrocious. Next up, someone might say it's the worst story on Days of Our Lives history, and it's a bad one, but I don't think it ruined any characters, but it was it was really bad television, and it looked terrible. It's the virtual Eden, where Greta and Austin have to do this virtual Garden of Eden shit that makes no sense so that Greta could be crowned princess. And the story at least led to the coronation massacre, which was very violent, but I enjoyed it. I was a kid. But the lead up to that was bad because it looked bad. They're trying to do this virtual reality where Greta and Austin are like Adam and Eve, and they're the Garden of Eden, and they have to like not die during this virtual reality, which maybe this was just 20 years before its time, because we're getting the metaverse and everything's going to be so virtual, and everything right now seems to be leading to something like this. But at least the execution didn't work at that point, but maybe it really was 20 years ahead of its time. I don't know. But the story looked bad, and it lasted for at least a month, if not longer, which is terrible that it lasted that long. All right, I've made it to my worst 3 storylines in Days of Our Lives history, and this next one, for a long time, was one of the worst stories on Days, in my opinion. But it is Dr. Alex North, where Wayne Northrop, who played the original Roman, comes back as a new character, and so they're able to use past clips of Roman and Marlena together to make it seem like Marlena had a past with this Dr. North character. So it's like a retcon, and it's another long ass James E. Riley storyline. It definitely took place for over a year, if not a year and a half, where we have to believe that Marlena has this past with this guy, and John's trying to prove he's an abusive husband. And honestly, I don't think I watched the last several months of this storyline, so I don't even know how it ended. But yeah, James E. Riley's second stint on this show gave us some really bad stuff, because there's at least 3 storylines on my list that I'm pretty sure was his writing. So he gave us a lot of crap during his second stint, and Dr. Alex North was probably the worst of the crap that he gave us, because it was this huge retcon, and I don't know. Why not just bring him back as Roman, then, if you're going to bring him back on the show? Right, the second worst storyline in the history of Days is the Possession 2.0. No, it's not number 1, because number 1 has a special hatred in my heart. And it's kind of a combination of several stories at number 1 that I'll explain when I get there. But yeah, I put the Possession 2.0 second to worst ever, because I think it's bad. It's a joke. I mean, I've seen it like referred to as Passions-like, but I think it's even worse than Passions, because this is supposed to be the devil we're talking about. But Tabitha the Witch on Passions actually created some really dark stuff once in a while on that show. But this devil on Days is just giving us nothing. There's no point to the devil, first of all. There's no reason he's here. He's just here to mess with people for shits and giggles. There's no point to it. It's terrible stuff. It really is bad writing. It's like they're just throwing things at a wall with the story to see what sticks, but there's no rhyme or reason. Terrible. I can't believe they didn't just end it when they did, when it came out of Marlena. But no, they had to make the bad decisions like they always do and continue it through Johnny and make it look even more of a joke and make this show look like even more of a cartoon. Now, number 1, the worst story, and in this case it's really the worst stories in the history of Days of Our Lives, is anything Daniel Jonas. The Daniel Jonas era did a lot of damage to this show, because he damaged several characters, but he especially damaged Jennifer and Nicole. 2 great female characters this show has ever had, honestly, but Daniel Jonas kind of ruined both of them, and I don't think they've even still recovered. There was no chemistry between Daniel and Jennifer, but this goes back even further than this, where the character of Daniel is just like this guy that all the women in Salem throw themselves at, and they will destroy their lives just to fuck him. It was really weird shit. Like, somebody at that show or somebody at that network really had a crush on this the actor or the character, because it was absolutely absurd the lengths they would make women characters on this show go to be with Daniel Jonas, even though most of them had no chemistry. Like, I don't really think it like ruined Chelsea or Billy or Kate, even though I think Daniel had some kind of affair with all three of them, all in the same family. But it certainly ruined Jennifer. It made her unbearable. Daniel made Jennifer unbearable. And then when they put Daniel, there was even Daniel and Chloe, that was a bad affair as well, because they turned Chloe into a bit of a hoe, cheating on Lucas all the time. But the worst might be Nicole, because putting Nicole with Daniel took the life out of Nicole. Nicole used to be this firecracker character who was always interesting. And to me, she has never been interesting since Daniel. Putting Nicole with Daniel ruined the character of Nicole, and I get that the actress and actor dated in real life. But yeah, everything Daniel touched turned to shit, and I was so glad when they killed off the character. That might be the best thing Josh Griffith ever did in his soap opera career. So yeah, anything Daniel Jonas is the worst in Days of Our Lives history. Pick a Daniel Jonas couple, pick a Daniel Jonas character storyline, and it's the worst story in Days of Our Lives history. So the Possession 2.0 is saved only because this show gave us the absolute worst character in the history of soap operas. Yes, worse than Peter on General Hospital. Daniel Jonas, the worst character ever.